Gonna get us started. All right, welcome everybody. This is Bob Balfance from the Everyone Graduates Center at School of Education, Johns Hopkins. And along with my colleagues, I want to welcome you to our next monthly version of our Pathways to Adult Success COVID-19 and Social Justice Solution Forum, where we are creating a place to have a dialogue among members of the Pathways to Adult Success learning community and others that are interested in the topic, to put our minds and hearts together to figure out how we can keep progressing, helping our students progress, and especially those that face the greatest challenges in this most challenging of times. Today, we're going to be focusing on advancing historically underserved students during COVID-19 and beyond. And with that, I'll take us to the next slide to give us a little preview of what's coming. I'll just begin with a few insights on the challenge, and then we're going to spend the bulk of our time hearing solutions for some really, for some folks doing some really cutting edge work in various dimensions along the pathway from schooling, K-12 schooling to higher ed and onward. We're going to hear from our friends Jeremy Greenfield and Kim Cambridge at New Visions on some exciting work they're doing on post-secondary transitions and career readiness and how they've been able to pivot and adapt to the COVID space, but also using it to advance these goals for the long term. We're going to hear from Tracy Templin from the National Louis University on the exciting work they're doing to keep kids in college and succeeding in college once they succeed in transitioning to it. One fact you'll hear, but I always find is so impressive by the work they're doing, is that 72% of their students are first generation college students. So this is really at the forefront of what Pathways to Adult Success is trying to achieve, is we want to really expand that pathway and give everyone a strong pathway to adult success through post-secondary schooling and training. And then we're going to hear from Reyna at Education Strategy Group on ways to think about how we can increase those pipelines and really expand the number of 9th, 10th, and 11th graders that are ready to get those transition supports and ready to make that pivot into post-secondary, and also how we can learn to target our efforts to where perhaps the greatest supports and efforts are needed. And then as usual, we'll end with some idea and resource sharing amongst ourselves and hopefully find ways to keep supporting ourselves and our communities and our students through these trying times. On the next slide, just a few logistics. As always, we have a large and diverse group of folks on the call from K-12, higher ed, nonprofit, state departments of ed. So great diversity of folks to learn and share from. So we can hear from as many people as possible. We're going to really use the chat function to communicate. We ask people to keep themselves muted, except if you are presenting, but use the chat frequently and often to ask questions, share resources, share ideas, share perspectives. And after the call, as always, we'll send out everything, the recording, the resources, links to the tools mentioned to keep building our sharing of insights and knowledge. All right, and with that, let's get started. So what do we know about advancing historically underserved students? And I thought a good way to do this would just simply be to reflect on the framework that the past learning community has built over the past few years. And think about that this is really where the challenges of COVID-19 and social justice intersect, and really where students that are experiencing both often have the highest challenges and the less supports, right? So we know that for a long time, and continuing in many places, we have not sort of progress monitored all students on the things they need to do to show they are on the pathway to post-secondary readiness and success. We often made prejudgments and focused our resources on we thought the kids that this was appropriate for, or the kids who deserved it, or the good students, which, as we know, left many students out. Those students that were different from the mainstream in any way, those difference that came from different cultures or backgrounds, those students that were mobile often get lost. Even now, we know it's a huge problem of those. There's still high percents of kids in places that people have not found after COVID-19, right? They are still not really been reconnected to school. And we know that's going to disproportionately impact the most sort of historically underserved and disadvantaged students. We also know that we have not really been universal in our navigation and guidance supports, right? Again, those are often based on prejudgments for who gets those or who will be effective for. Even our cross-sector collaborations and networks, right, are often about expanding the pie, but not really trying to get to universal, right? And until we have a strategy that gets to universal for all, we're always going to have folks on the outside looking in, right? And be susceptible to all of society's prejudices and disadvantages and structural inequities. And finally, to get that data, right, that's uniform across systems, until everybody is visible, right, no one will be equally served. And so all those challenges present themselves in really advancing historically underserved students. But there's also a lot of good work going on, and that's what we really want to turn to and highlight now. So we're going to pivot now to our first solution strategies and hear from our good friends at New Visions.
Great, thanks so much, Bob. And want to thank you again for the invitation to share our work with this group. This has been a really important community for New Visions for a number of years. And I've truly enjoyed a lot of presentations of others. So if anyone has any questions, they should always feel free to reach out to Kim and myself. So today we're going to be speaking about what we're referring to as the COVID pivot, really focusing in on two programmatic shifts that we made during the spring and the summer. Now, my name is Jeremy Greenfield. I lead up the college access and success work here at New Visions. I'm joined by Kim Cambridge, who leads our community engagement and family engagement work. So I'll be speaking first and then passing this on to Kim. So if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, please. Some of you may be familiar with New Visions already. We're a school support and improvement organization. We've been working with New York City students. We've been a close partner to the Department of Education for over 30 years. We work with over 700 schools in one manner or another in the city, but really our focus is on the 10 charter schools that we directly manage and 71 district schools that will be that we have the closest relationship with. And those are the schools that we'll be focusing on today. If we could go to the next slide, please. Now, an important frame before we launch into the two important changes we made in this spring and summer is to give a sense of our post-secondary vision at New Visions. And this vision really is undergirded by the idea that all students deserve the opportunity to develop college and career knowledge and complete sequential milestones beginning in 9th grade, going on to 10th, 11th, and 12th, all of which would build on and build into a clear and supported post-secondary plan. And we're bringing this about through a vision that we articulated almost 2 years ago, that every New Vision school in our core network will support students and their caregivers so that students graduate high school with a post-secondary plan that includes best fit education, training, or employment, and the skills and experience to succeed in that plan. Now, when we first established this vision, we anticipated that there would be obstacles coming up ahead. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you so much. But what we didn't anticipate was a global pandemic, right? So this summer, this spring has added a serious wrinkle to our work. And this pandemic has upended the lives of New Yorkers in any number of ways, just 3 of which I identify here on this slide, which is the coronavirus led to school closure, to historic cuts in the cities, indeed the country's largest youth employment program, as well as dire college enrollment projections. We saw a lot of our students really rethinking whether or not they wanted to go on to college in the fall. And so we knew we had to do something. So if you wouldn't mind progressing to the next slide, the first change that we made had to do with our existing program that we call Bridge to College. So what's Bridge to College? Bridge to College is a near-peer support program that we work with over 20 high schools across New York City in Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan, and support over 2,000 students to help them make the transition from high school onto college or whatever their post-secondary pathway may be. Now, this program is intended to address the summer melt phenomenon, as well as buttress school-based advising, right? I don't have to tell the folks on this call that our counselors across the country have caseloads that are far too large and are structurally prevented from giving each student all the support that they need. So our program, by providing additional near-peer mentors at each high school, helps to provide another lending hand. So this is a program that we had extant for a number of years, but with COVID, we knew we had to make a major shift with virtual. The first had to do with the coaches themselves, the 23 coaches that we had on the ground. They were going through serious traumatic moments, right? They had their families sick. We had some coaches who had family members who died, and we knew that we needed to change our supervisory and support structure. So we moved from what had been an initial support front load at the beginning of the summer to providing weekly touch points with these young members of the community. The second shift is something that the youth led themselves, and that was using social media platforms like Snapchat, Facebook Messenger, text messages to get in touch with the graduating high schools students who during the summer in between high school and college were not able to visit to the school to get that support. The other two programmatic shifts that I think are really important to note are something that we did on the data side. The first was we really focused in on some clear milestones, including FAFSA completion, TAP completion, post-secondary commitments, and course registrations. That is, instead of monitoring 500 data points, we really focused in on these core ones. And then we also established and created a data dashboard that allowed the managers of the program to manage it from a central place. Now, this was one key important modification that we made, but I want to pass it off to Kim at this point to share some work that we also did in the career space.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. If we could advance to the next slide. So one thing I want to be clear to share is that the design of this summer career exploration program was unprecedented in that the New Vision's board of directors raised dollars specifically for us to be able to address the challenge of the cancellation of summer youth employment in New York City and other summer employment opportunities. We know that that is a key resource that families look to support students during the summer in terms of financial gain. And so we wanted to really look at how do we be able to meet the immediate need, but also capitalize on opportunities to connect summer learning to school, college, and career readiness. And so from that, we actually created this summer career exploration pilot. It was 4 weeks. And we serviced about 181 young people. This experience was specifically for those schools that are part of our charter network, which includes 8 traditional schools and 2 transfer high schools. And our transfer high schools are for students who are over age and undercredited. What's key to highlight in terms of the design of working with our charter schools is that as a network, it provided the opportunity for us to directly provide support to predominantly Black and Latinx young people who make up the communities that attend our schools overall. We did a very quick pivot. We worked with 3 partners whom we have worked with in other spaces, but ideally the goal was for young people to actually have these career exploration experiences, to also earn key milestones towards their college and career transition, which included completion of interest surveys, career plans, resumes, developing a LinkedIn profile, but also keenly connected to that is to really also be able to capitalize on CDOS hours, which is Career Development and Occupational Studies credential, which is a key support for young people, one, in terms of whether or not it's just having the endorsement for graduation, a way for an employer to know that young people have had access to key skill sets, or secondly, for some students, it is used as an option to also support the graduation. What came out of this overall is that we've really built ourselves into a really challenging quandary where schools have been engaged, students have been engaged, and now the question has been, how do we keep this going? And so if we can transition to the next slide, one of the things that we're really thinking about in the learning, and as Jeremy highlighted, is if this is an opportunity that provided equitable access for all young people. The criteria to participate in the program was very light. It really was just that young people could commit to engaging 3 hours each day and could be involved to the end of the program. And it was really on the school to determine who those students were. So we had a really great mix. It wasn't the high flyers. And in fact, it was really the students who more often than not don't have access to employment experiences. But what we've learned from Bridge to College, as well as this career exploration piece, is that starting early matters. As Jeremy said, that shift to moving remote, the college coaches had already had an opportunity to engage with schools and with young people. So it made it much easier to build relationships and engagement once we moved into the virtual realm. But when we also thought about the career exploration, when we realized that summer youth employment was in danger, we didn't immediately respond in terms of saying we were going to definitely do a program. We were really waiting to see what was going to happen in the city, which meant that we had to do a very quick pivot. We realized that, remote coaching alleviated supervisory burden at the school level, that we continue to build and think about how do we maximize on our resources. As Jeremy said, the coaches needed more SEL support, but so did the young people who were participating in the career exploration. We essentially ended school and quickly transitioned into the career opportunities. There's also an importance of clarity and intentionality when recruiting students to ensure equitable access. One of the challenges is that because there wasn't a very defined criteria, we actually ended up with a high number of young people who would have been classified students with disabilities, which meant that we had to provide more wraparound supports to help young people meet the actual tasks that were assigned to them. When we think about the remaining opportunities, we want to continue to build on what the learnings have been, that we realized that, though shifting to remote was unexpected, it actually does provide an opportunity for us to expand what our current career exploration experiences are for scholars, as well as really thinking about how do we engage more partners, that supporting schools to develop systems for tracking student career learning experiences. So we want to make sure that schools are able to build on this, so it impacts the design of courses and what students are assigned to. We want to continue to deepen the linkages between high school support, summer support, and college onboarding, as well as integrating high school data and summer transition data systems. And finally, I think ultimately is elevating the importance of tracking post-secondary plans. The opportunities and experiences that young people had this summer actually helps to meet milestones in them thinking about what their post-secondary transition plans would be. And we want to make sure that it's documented in a way that both young people, families, and schools are working collaboratively to determine what the best fit opportunities are for young people based on future experiences.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you both for the programs themselves and for the intensity with which you're learning from them. I invite people to ask their questions or share their ideas in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'll just ask the first two questions. On the bridges to college, Jeremy, I'm wondering, of the things you were tracking, is there one that ended up being more challenging than others for either the mentors to support or the students to complete?
I think that's a good question. I think probably the most difficult would be course registration. And that's because, it just happens last, right? So you can work with students for many months to do FAFSA and TAP, and maybe there are going to be challenges along the way, and you can basically work them out, but you cannot register for courses until you know where you're going. And so given where we were this summer, we had a lot of students who, would have liked to have made their decision by June 1st, but didn't make that into the summer. So I think that was one difficult thing to note. The other thing is, now that as an organization, we've really embraced the concept of a career pathway as a valid pathway that is, on par in many ways with a college pathway. Then the question becomes, what is the equivalent of a career commitment? Right? With college, it's pretty easy. And we've been kind of doing this as a field for 10, 20 years. Okay, well, you put your deposit in, so we know you're going to your college. Now, what is it on the career side? Because career space is such a diverse space, it required us to kind of make some decisions. And what was the second question, Bob?
That was it. Thanks.
That was it.
And,
okay.
Yeah. And Kimberly, I'm going to ask you the positive version of it. Was there, of the sort of career exploration activities, was there one or two that stood out and was more captivating for the students?
Yes, actually, they all spoke to actually having direct access to mentors from the business field. JP Morgan Chase actually committed to doing the actual mock interviews with students and actually doing the follow-up. And so I think in terms of just having direct access from folks who are in the field, there were senior staff that were participating that made the difference. And I think the other was just the general career panels of actually hearing from a range of folks in finance and understanding that there are like 10 different jobs that are related to finance, that you can be an HR professional working in an investment firm. You could be the data person, the office manager, whatever it is that made the difference. And I think the final thing I'd say is that what was powerful about this is that young people had to do career plans, but they had to keep refining their career plans based on every career panel they participated in. So it was really great to see where a young person started in thinking about what they wanted to do to where they actually ended at the end of the 4 weeks.
Wow, thank you. That's really, really interesting to learn. So I think just to build a transition, that what's powerful about the New Visions work and work that other Pathways to Adult Success community members are doing is really owning this transition space between high school and post-secondary career and college. And for the longest time, nobody owned that space. And now this is really our pivot now to Tracy, who can pick up the story that we got the transition, we've got the course registration, and now what happens? So Tracy, take it away.
Great, thank you. You can go ahead and move to the next line. So my name is Tracy Templin. I'm the Executive Director of Strategy and Operations for National Louis University. I'm specifically working in the undergraduate college at INLU. Similar to Jeremy and Kimberly, I'm really going to talk about our COVID pivot and how we've really tried to address the needs of our students and the infrastructure to support our students during the double pandemics that we have with COVID and the racial injustice that many of our students are experiencing. So you can just a little bit about INLU. So we are a private nonprofit university. We're located in downtown Chicago. If anyone's familiar with Chicago, we're right across the street from the Art Institute. But we also have a total of 5 campuses, several in the Chicagoland area, and then also one in Tampa, Florida. We overall serve around 9,000 students. within our undergraduate college, we serve about 3,000, and our history and reputation is really focused on community impact and career preparation. That is really prevalent in our undergraduate college, as our college was founded very recently. The undergraduate college at INLU was just established in 2018, and we had historically served more adult and transfer students, largely a graduate university, graduate students being served. And then 2015, we started serving first-time freshman students. So that was a very actually unique population for us. And then 2018, we established the undergraduate college with a mission to drive equity in bachelor degree attainment. So I'm not, I'll allude to components of our model in the undergraduate college, but the college was really structured to remove institutional and systemic barriers to accessing college and completing college and entering into sustainable, meaningful employment. So our tuition is set at $10,000 a year, which is in the state of Illinois, the most affordable four-year private degree a student can get. We talked about advising. I think Jeremy alluded to just advising caseloads, especially in a college or university setting. We have student success coaches. Every student has one. Their caseloads are 100 to 120 students per coach. So really providing intensive wraparound supports, very predictable scheduling, so students can balance work and school at the same time. So we have a lot of structures in place to really, just at our core, address barriers for access and completion. And as Bob mentioned earlier, about 72% of our students are first generation college goers. We also have about 3/4 of our students that identify as Black or Latinx. About 77% students are Pell or undocumented. So we serve a very diverse community, and really feel that brings so much to the environment of our college. I can go ahead and advance to the next slide. So with that, also, in the midst of these double pandemics, there's a lot of key challenges that we had to address. And so when we think about that, those challenges, we think about it as ensuring, a successful transition to remote learning. So when COVID hit and Illinois went on lockdown, we were actually in the last week of our winter term. So we're on a quarter or a trimester system. So it was the last week of our winter term. And then we, had a little bit of a spring break and then went into our spring term. And so really wanted to be able to end the winter term strong and then also start strong in spring. And so really utilize, multi-faceted communication tools. We repurposed our staff that had been, either security or, working at our campus locations. And due to lockdown, instead of furloughing those employees, we actually repurposed those employees to start doing outreach to students and make calls, letting students know, hey, don't come to campus this last week of the term. Oh, hey, guess what? School is starting. We're still open. We're still starting. School in the spring. First day of classes is this date. And we got a lot of positive outreach from students because of that, or response from students. So they actually really appreciated being able to talk to a real life person on the phone and talk about concerns of coming back to or going to school remotely, but just really appreciated that outreach. Text campaigns, utilizing staff to do text campaigns to students to have them really finish strong and start strong in the spring. So, and then, kind of coming into the fall term now, as we're still remote, we've really looked on how do we onboard our new freshmen. And so what, completely revamping orientation to be, help build skills for students and starting class remotely. What does a classroom look like in remote instruction? How do they access the technology and the tools that we're using? So really kind of building that into students' onboarding experiences. We talked about Bob mentioned the transition to from high school to college. One of the things that we do in our model is have students meet with their success coach even prior to day one. And so prior to even being registered. So across the summer, students that have deposited, we're reaching out and having those Zoom meetings. Usually we have them come to campus, but trying to do that all remotely so that students have a very strong onboarding experience. I'm going to get into number 2 on the next slide, which is really kind of all the support components and how we pivoted our student support structure. But thinking again also how we support faculty in the remote environment as well was something that was really important for us. So ensuring that faculty felt comfortable, had the knowledge and the skills themselves to be able to keep their students engaged, to feel confident teaching over Zoom versus being in that classroom and seeing their students every week. So really, besides kind of really enhancing our PD offering, so having university-wide PD around preparing for class over Zoom, addressing social emotional needs during a time of collective trauma, accessibility and accommodation for students in a remote learning environment. So really those kind of very key skills that faculty will need to know as they transition to the remote, but also supporting, faculty and how they had questions as they were interacting with students that were also experiencing the implications of COVID as well. And so, for them, we really stressed this kind of do no harm, universal approach with students as they finished their winter term and persisting through the spring. And what that meant is, encouraging faculty to work really closely with students. And if something has come up, they had a family member fall sick, or something was coming up in their personal life, there can be deadline extensions. How do you have a conversation with the student about prioritizing the work that matters most for them to achieve the learning objectives of the course versus maybe some busy work that was built in so you can have that assessment, right? So really being real with faculty and with students on how we can best help students succeed throughout that term. And then the other thing, which is actually part of our core instruction, our core model, but that really came into play during this time, is that we have our faculty meet in department or content teams weekly, and the subject of those meetings differ, but bi-weekly they actually talk about their lesson plans. And so as a team teaching, all the instructors that teach English 101 or all the instructors that teach our Science 101 class can come together and they can talk about how are we going to best facilitate this lesson over Zoom next week, right? What are some instructional strategies that teachers are using and sharing best practices and resources? And that structure really came in handy during this time as all the instructors are kind of learning how to teach over Zoom and teach remotely. And so that has really served us well during this time. If you go to the next slide. Supporting students. And so we had to do a lot of pivots to support our students in the same, kind of wraparound approach that we had previously. So a big piece of this is collaboration. So I just mentioned that faculty met in weekly meetings. Every other week was with their content teams, but then on the subsequent weeks, it is actually a group of faculty and success coaches and support staff that meet together. And so during those weeks, they actually review student data and student engagement, and then are able to problem solve, are able to discuss what's going on with that student. Maybe what has been happening. Have they had a family member that is impacted by COVID? What's going on, what's the best way for those instructors and the coach to help serve that student. And so those meetings were really pivotal. We also created, we are very data informed at the institution. We use data in pretty much every day, everything that's going on. And so our success coaches, we built a new dashboard around student engagement. So previously when you have, face-to-face courses, attendance is a lot of what we look at when we're meeting remotely. Although yes, logging in to the Zoom class is super important, but we wanted to get even more granular and really look at students' engagement of their course logins, submitting discussion posts, how they're interacting within their course shell. And so we created a student engagement dashboard that coaches could really utilize to prioritize outreach to students, to check in and make sure everything was going okay. All our student support services, which had, primarily our student finance office, our career office, have always been more operating in a face-to-face atmosphere. We, transitioned everything to remote. And what we did is we created a kind of a one-stop concierge for students. So we didn't want students to have to navigate and try to figure out, okay, what number do I call for this service and what number do I call for this service? And we said, okay, here's your one-stop shop. Call this number, you're going to be connected with a live person over Zoom, and whatever your question is, they're going to give you that direct handoff to a team member. So you call into one number, you talk to someone, and then they will then bring in someone else and connect you right there to the spot, to the person that you need access to. So students, we found really positive feedback from students for that approach and getting them connected with the resources that they need. Students faced a lot of financial barriers. In our survey, I think it was 48% of students that we had surveyed during this time in the spring and the summer were impacted financially for COVID, so had loss of income. Over 55% of our students indicated that they couldn't purchase a basic needs necessity. So whether that was paying for internet or paying for medical bills or getting food on the table, food insecurity. So we completely expanded our emergency assistance fund that was funded partially through CARES, the CARES Act that Congress passed. That does only impact a small portion of the students that we serve. So we also had to supplement that with philanthropic funds. And so we also launched a COVID scholarship to really help in that tuition assistance bucket, because CARES funding doesn't cover tuition, and a lot of our students could no longer afford to pay their tuition bill. And so we really wanted to be able to support students on that. And then tech needs is one of the biggest needs that we saw. So students not having a quiet space to study, or like noise canceling headphones, students not having a laptop, students not having reliable internet access. And so we did a lot of things. We did a bulk order of laptops. We bought a whole bunch of laptops. It was a huge scramble because everybody was buying laptops. So there's some back orders and everything, but trying to get laptops into students' hands, trying to get noise canceling headphones, trying to get, we developed a hotspot lending library so students could check out a hotspot if they needed access to internet. So really just trying to get students access to the tech that they needed. And then, of course, student engagement and wellness. So transitioning all of our student activities, our student advisory council, any of the kind of student groups and organizations that we're meeting, we still wanted those to go strong. So we transitioned those remotely, and then really expanded the wellness services that we're offering as well. So having some like wellness corners, having anxiety groups that meet. Last year we hired an in-house counselor. So we have both contracted counseling, but then we also have a counselor that's on staff for us. And so that came in really handy again as students were experiencing additional anxiety and mental health related issues during this time. Can advance. And so just, some highlights and results of that. In spring, our student attendance rate was actually higher than it was in the prior year. So we found that more students were actually engaged in attending class. Our students also, we had higher performance and credit attainment at the end of last year compared to prior year. Again, we assisted over 1,500 students with emergency support. So, cash checks to students to help pay those bills. And then we had a really high satisfaction. Almost 90% of our students were satisfied with our transition to the remote learning environment. Things, kind of continuing that we're working on and continuing learnings that we've had. Again, keeping up that persistent communication, using multi-channels to communicate with students. We've definitely found that our continuing students actually engaged more remotely, but those first year students, the freshmen, were the ones that we found to kind of struggled the most or were challenged the most by the transition to the remote environment. So that really helped inform all the onboarding and the pieces that we put in place in the fall to help students start strong in their freshman year. And then again, I think, I mentioned before, but just, continuing to address the ongoing student challenges that come up around having quiet study space, having internet access. Some of our students also reported having increased hours due to COVID. So if they were working, for instance, in a grocery store, if they were working in, as an essential worker, they actually had increased hours in the spring, and being able to balance that is definitely something we continue to work with students on. And then again, just staying connected to the university in a remote environment is also something that we are continuing to be very creative about as we go into the fall term, especially for new students, as this is their first intro into college.
Tracy, thank you so much. If I invite folks to put questions in the chat, to share reflections, if they have other examples from other universities are doing. Just one quick comment and a quick question before we get to Ryan. Again, it strikes me that one of the things we're trying to do in the Pathways to Adult Success is create increased communication between higher ed and their local K-12 systems. And it's just so striking how many of those issues that you were dealing with are exact issues school districts are dealing with. And we still have to work on creating that learning loop between them so that folks can share ideas. I mean, I'm sure others have thought of it, but the idea of noise canceling headphones is a small thing to be added to our must along with a computer and a hotspot, right? You can have that, but if you can't hear, you can't really participate. The other question I wanted to ask you is, can you share how you're tracking engagement online? Because I know a lot of folks are trying to figure that out. So if you have any shareable tools or things, I think folks would appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, so as far as kind of attendance in Zoom, and we're looking into, our IT team is looking into being able to track logins to Zoom, because right now we do track it manually. So our faculty, will take Zoom attendance and they can, get a list of participants, and then they log that into their course shell in our learning management system. So if people are familiar with Blackboard, or we use Desire to Learn, D2L. So right now that's manually tracked, but we're looking at how to track that more systemically through our IT team. But then as far as students' engagement in our learning management system, so that is actually all things that we're able to track on the back end. So students logging into their course, students interacting, clicking on pages, students being able to do discussion posts, we're able to see that activity. And then we've created kind of a visual and some markers of the days since the students last logged in, the number of the times the student has accessed different course material, the number of discussion posts that they've had, within the last 7 days, et cetera, and to give us kind of a range of different metrics that we can use to get a more comprehensive view of how they are engaging in that course.
Thanks so much. And with that, I'm going to pivot to Ryan to bring us home from the Education Strategy Group and the work they've been doing on creating metrics to make sure all our kids are on track to take advantage of the increasing number of resources that are being given for transitions and early college experiences. Ryan?
Thanks, Bob. Excited to be here this afternoon to share a little bit about our report from Tails to Heads. We can go to the next slide. So we have a huge missed opportunity in this country based on some of the research that we just did and came out with. We found that even before the pandemic happened, about 1 million students each year graduate high school and don't enroll in any sort of post-secondary education or training within a year of graduation. So in a time where we know that a post-secondary credential is sort of a door opener to long-term success, we're seeing about 1/3 of our students walk across the graduation stage and then move on to a path of uncertainty or long-term challenge. And unfortunately, as we all know, for Black, Hispanic, and low-income students, they're much more likely to delay their journeys into higher education than their white peers. For white students overall nationally, the seamless or direct enrollment rate is about 66%. For Black students, it's 58%. For Hispanic and low-income students, it's around 52%. And as you can see from the maps on the screen, there's quite a bit of variation state to state in terms of that enrollment rate. And our early estimates, and certainly what was shared by the other presenters today, confirm that the numbers are likely going to be a lot worse, or are already a lot worse as a result of COVID. We saw some surveys over the summer that nearly half of Black and Hispanic students expected to change or cancel their education plans as a result of the pandemic, as compared to only about a quarter of their white peers. On the next slide. Ultimately, we think no one's chances for economic mobility should come down to a coin flip. And when we went out and looked at high school transitions into higher education, we found on estimate kind of nationally that there are about 7,000 what we call coin flip high schools where that actually is the chance. If you're Black, Hispanic, low income, your chance of proceeding into higher education directly after high school is less than 50%. And we know that it's not actually chance that influences student outcomes, rather it's longstanding systemic barriers. That being said, we think there are and know that there are schools, districts, and charter networks, New Visions is a great example, in every state that are showing that it's possible to flip that trajectory of post-secondary preparation and success for Black, Hispanic, and low-income students. So more than just quantifying the problem, our report really sought to capture some of the key points of focus from these leading sites in the hope that we could spur kind of a more widespread movement. And over the past decade, through significant efforts of folks on this webinar, we've seen the country be able to cut in half the number of dropout factory high schools. And we think it's time now to focus that same attention on the coin flip high schools. On the next slide. As we all know, what gets measured gets done. So the first step to addressing the coin flip high school challenge is really to center, we think, our collective work on a clear set of post-secondary transition metrics for states and communities to prioritize. So what we term the momentum metrics that we put forward in our report represent 8 of the most predictive indicators of post-secondary preparation, retention, and success. We selected the measures based on their demonstrated use in systems that have shown positive improvements, especially for students of color and low-income students. And we looked at 3 important criteria as we were trying to narrow down that list of measures, recognizing that there are quite a few measures, obviously, that can be focused on. And how we did that was we looked at whether the metrics were 1, broadly available, 2, timely, so that educators and others, community members could actually derive resources, and then 3, actionable around that notion. So the momentum metrics are organized around some of the key phases of a student's transition from high school to college, namely preparing, applying, and ultimately enrolling. Hopefully some of the measures that you see on the screen look familiar to this crowd. They certainly are components of early warning data systems that are in place in many of your locations. But there are a couple that are newer or newer ways of looking at traditional data that I wanted to just briefly highlight. The first is advanced course potential. So we all know that students that are able to access dual enrollment, AP, IB, have and be successful in those courses have greater likelihood of moving on into higher education. What we haven't done enough, we think, is to really look at the potential number of students that could and should be accessing those courses, and really think about schools as generating data on the percentage of students that have shown that potential and then ultimately are able to actually complete that course as a way of really driving home the equity of access. Second interesting measure or newer measure is around college match. Many of the high-performing charter networks have been focusing on this recently, and that's really looking at and making sure that students are applying and ultimately, hopefully, enrolling in institutions that match their academic preparation and the sort of selectivity levels. So really trying to start to measure how many seniors have been admitted to at least one of their match institutions. And then finally, because as Bob has sort of said multiple times, and we agree with completely, there needs to be this better handoff and collective ownership of the space between K-12 and higher ed. We think it's really critical that we're also looking at how students are progressing once they move into higher education. And gateway course completion or entry-level course completion has been shown to be a really strong predictor of retention and ultimately long-term success. So the metrics that we pulled together really are first and foremost supposed to help educators and administrators sort of target resources and supports at the individual student level. And we think that as students complete each of these steps, it'll ultimately open doors to access for post-secondary education and hopefully hope them succeed in higher education in the long run. And at the same time, we think there is value in aggregating the metrics at the school, district, and even state level to have broader conversations about advising policies and programs and interventions. Next slide. So individually and collectively, these are very highly predictive measures. So how do we actually get more schools and districts to prioritize them? We think there's a really strong and important current challenge, and that is that in some form or fashion, all of the data that we offer up in this report is available at local, community, institution, even state levels. But unfortunately, far too often, they're siloed from the individuals that need them the most. Even as we did our study in trying to calculate the coin flip high schools, we were only able to get access to post-secondary enrollment data from about 27 states, even though it's a requirement of ESSA. And the data availability at the practitioner level is even worse. So according to a RAND survey, you see some of the data here on the slide, nearly 2/3 of teachers and about 1/4 of principals don't know where their students go after high school. And the lack of information around data such as college match or FAFSA completion or even remediation is even more substantial. So we think we need to find a way to make prioritizing the most predictive measures of post-secondary preparations and transitions and success ultimately the norm rather than the exception. And so we're looking for two things. One, we hope that there is some collective leadership at both the state and local levels to commit to these measures and specifically to make some changes to policy and practice that we lay out in the report. And we think ultimately, if we're really going to flip the script for millions of students, we need many more communities that are sort of making these metrics their North Star. And we're trying at ESG, trying to build a coalition of willing districts, community partners, states who want to put these metrics in place and then sort of collectively share the work that they're doing to deliver supports to students. So I certainly would invite anybody that is interested in being part of such a network to reach out to me directly for further discussion. And thank you guys for the time today to talk about the report, and hope you have a chance to dig into it in more detail after the call.
Thank you, Ryan. And as folks, please put your questions or comments or resources in the chat. I'll kick it off and say that I think, one thing that I think pulls this session together and advancing historically underserved students is we have folks like New Visions and National Louis University showing this work can be done to really make the case that it has to be done, right? And then Ryan sort of reminds us of how far we have to go at a national level. And if you think about it, right, we're not going to be able to advance historically underserved students until almost every high school knows where their students go the next year. And the fact that it's currently a majority don't know is really problematic to our long-term quest for equity and equality and high outcomes for all. And I think the thing I think we all need to reflect upon is that I think there's going to be an opening post-COVID, right, to rethink high school graduation requirements and high school and post-secondary data and sharing, because as we know, many districts, because there was no choice, dropped many high school graduation requirements that were hard fought and deeply debated for a decade, disappeared in a week. And I think that presents an opening for us to rethink those and really focus on key metrics, as Ryan and others have pointed out, that are really predictive of long-term success. Because we now have the longitudinal data to understand that, right? We didn't always used to have that longitudinal data, especially to understand state variation, and we do now. And I think if we build it on that data, I think we'll have better metrics and a better ability to track them and a better ability for schools to know, right? Because until schools know, how do they know if they have to change what they're doing, right? Fundamentally. With that, I'm just going to pivot to bring it to a close today. Well, before I do, sorry, if there's anybody has an open thought or idea or something they want to share, please put it into the chat on this idea of how we can advance historically underserved students during COVID and beyond. And we will make sure to share out what you're sharing in the chat with everybody in our follow-up communications. I'm just going to bring us to a close today, just sharing a few resources and a few next presentations that are out there. Some things that have come across the transom recently that I think are useful to the Pathways to Adult Success group is there is a good report from the Aspen Institute and also I believe the Casey Foundation on talking to employers about what they're looking for in young adults, as we're really talking about these, career explorations of new visions and others, and making career preparation equal with college preparation. It's fundamental to get better understanding of what those employers are looking for in young adults. That's a good place to look. Couple of good studies on supporting students of color and males of color and their post-secondary pathways preparation based on case studies in New York. And then one at the end, rethinking how to support males of color, where they brought together this sort of post-secondary readiness representatives from multiple school districts and asked them to think big. What would it take to move this forward? Interesting, another report by our friend Ryan here from the Education Commission of the States on how to think about establishing state-level post-secondary advising networks, which is really New Vision's idea blown up big, as well as National Lewis with their success coaches reaching down. Both those are places doing it, and this is folks thinking about how we could do that more broadly. We go to our next slide. We have some upcoming webinars from some of our partners. Our friends at Talent Development Secondary are continuing their series of adopting early warning systems to COVID. And this one is going to be Thursday, actually, at 11:30. It's going to focus on the very topic we're talking about today, is how to ensure all seniors graduate ready for any post-secondary option. And they're going to be bringing some other folks that are doing some advanced work in this field. Our friends at the Center for Promise and America's Promise Alliance have a conversation with young people on their experiences on the world of work, really to hear from our end users, always important to do. And then finally, our next PASH Solutions Forum will be November 17th. And the focus there will be promoting equity during COVID-19. We got some exciting past learning community members lined up to present their solutions during that. I want to thank everybody for their continued great and important work in these trying times, and just really encourage us to keep supporting and helping helping each other get through this and help our students and our communities not only survive but thrive as they work through and out of it. We'll be sending out a recording of the session, a copy of the slides and the materials to everybody who signed up for our webinar. And we thank you. Be well, and as always, onwards. Take care.